Naruto remastered. Let's get started right now. We left off last time with the Naruto story beginning. So one day, Chris would knock on someone's door. You see, this person hasn't mentioned since the Great Ninja War ended. When that door opens, it's actually Minato. He's Minato, and he says, Christian's got his head down. He's like, he says, whoa, what's going on with you? He says, boredom. He says, Minato says, come in. He says, okay. He says, Kushina. Guess who came? He says, who? He says, me. He says, oh, you. He says, congratulations on becoming the new Sage of Six Paths. He says, wait, how did you know? He says, because, remember you had an inauguration for it? He says, you had an inauguration? He says, yeah. Well, I've been bored doing, he says, since Naruto's been Hokage, Sasuke's out of the village, Itachi's a house person, is basically stuck in the house all day, because he can't really do anything, because, yeah. And also, we have, no one else is strong enough to fight, so guess I could ask you. First, if you want to train. He says, sure, I guess I will. I guess we can train. So when they go outside, Chris would say, I won't use all my power, since, well, wait, how old are you, Minato? He says, 45? He says, geez, 45? He says, I'm kidding, I'm about 50. I don't really know how old Minato would be in this thing, because it wouldn't make any sense for Naruto to be 23 or some crap. For Naruto to be like 25 and Minato to be 45, because that means he'd have Naruto at 25 years old. Which makes absolutely no sense. He'd be like, alright Minato, you ready? Minato would pull out his Flying Rising Kunai, and Krishna would pull out his own God Kunai, which is already enveloped in chakra. He says, yeah! And they both disappear and clash kunai, but Krishna just breaks through the Flying Rising. Minato goes, oh! And then he kicks Minato in the stomach, kicking him far back, saying, oh, did I hit him too hard? Dang, I have to watch myself. He says, no, I'm alright. He says, disappearing, saying, going for a punch, which would dodge and say, punching Minato right in the stomach, sending him flying back, saying, well, looks like this is going to be another boring match. He says, come on, Minato, use your Kurama chakra mode. He says, goes into KCM2. He's like, finally! And transform into Kurama. He's like, whoa! Kurama's a little overboard, but I'm down. Susanoo! He says, geez, that Susanoo is bigger than my... Minato was like... He says, Susanoo Chidori! He says, Minato says, Rasengan! Because I'm pretty sure Minato doesn't say Rasengan, he says Rasengan. He says, Rasengan! They clash, they go, ah! Naruto feels that explosion. He's like, what the heck? He says, a Kurama and a Susanoo. He sees them clashing, going, ja, ja, yeah. Naruto says, well, it's technically my day off, and maybe if I get all my work done before they do this, I can get over there. He says, wait, why don't I just create a shadow clone? He says, shadow clone jutsu! And then just speeds out the Hokage door, going, he says, let's go, Chris! Let's go, Kurama! Goes into goes into Six Paths Sage mode without the orbs, and goes boom. And when Boruto steps out of his house, he gets sent flying back in. He goes, just like, what happened? He says, I think Dad was rushing. He says, Naruto! He's like, until he finally reaches the bottom and says, let's go, Kurama! Turning into Kurama, and Rizen's like, oh, you wanna go? Let's go! Wait, and he says, wait a minute, I thought you had work. He says, I left the shadow alone. He goes, ah! He says, come on, you two, come at me. So he says, Dad, you ready? I have a cool technique that we can do. He says, alright, Naruto. He goes into Sage mode. Plus that, and then he infuses into the triple Kurama. Rizen says, oh, this is gonna be fun. Then Itachi and Sasuke sees it, and he's like, I'm joining in. I am 100% joining in. This looks too fun to pass off. Sasuke would jump in, and he goes, Sasuke also speeds over, going, I wanna come as well. Don't leave me out. Running, going, Sasuke says, Susanoo! They all have a Titan Clash battle, and they say, going, and Sasuke accidentally tripped Sarada in the middle of running when he didn't even realize. He was going, Sakura and Hinata are mad. They're like, they're like, dang it, why would they do? And Kushina is also mad because, well, she knocked over her, Minato knocked over, Naruto knocked over her. The three of them are like, we have to stop them, and they're like, what could Naruto be such in a rush for that his Hokage jump has to be second? He says, let's go. So they run, and they finally reach the side, and they're like, huh? And they realize they did this for a fun fight. Sakura would jump up and break Sasuke and say, jump into Sasuke Susanoo, saying, huh? And Hinata jumping in Naruto's Kurama, saying, and a thing jumping in and Kushina jumping in Minato's Kurama, and they all get a punch to the face, saying, why would you do that? And they say, why doesn't he get in trouble? He says, huh? I didn't do nothing, bye, and teleports out of there, and they're like, alright, well. And he says, why don't he get a punch? Because then they say, because he's the sage of the six paths. Duh, if we get him mad, he won't want to protect us anymore. He says, so you're using him? He says, no, we're still friends, just, we don't really want to make our friend mad. I mean, like, he did nothing wrong. He says, all he wanted to do was have some fun. Naruto and Sasuke, you guys kind of ruined it. He says, Christian says, yeah, you guys did kind of ruin it. Me and Minato were just doing some light sparring, but I was also kind of happy when Naruto came, because I needed more of a challenge. But, Naruto, you should be careful where you're running to not run over your own son to send him back in the house. He says, sorry. He says, don't say sorry. Hinata says, don't say sorry to me. Say sorry to him. It's Kid Boruto, who's about 4 years old, being like, I mean, no, he's already 9, being like, yeah. Saying, you really did hurt me, but I'm fine. He says, are you guys hurt that much? He sees a scratch in Boruto's arm, saying, Naruto? And says, Amethyst Orb! Sending Naruto back, and he says, don't touch the child. He says, don't you ever touch my nephew, don't you ever hurt him again. And he says, you too, Sarada. And gives them both high fives and says, here. He heals their jutsu, and she says, when did you ever learn medical ninjutsu? He says, I'm the one who taught you it. And he goes, I taught most of all your jutsus to you guys. The rest of them you developed. Christian says, whatever, let's just get started. He says, Minato, would you like to continue? He says, I'm way too old to do this. He says, wait, how old are you? And he's like, I lost count of how old I was. Christian's like, yeah, I expected it. He says, what? And he says, well, Boruto Sarda, you want to go another ride? They say, yeah. And they somehow jump out of their karamas and Christian catches them into his Susanoo and says, bye! And flies them off. And he says, hold on, wait a minute. We have to make a stop. He turns around and heads to Naruto's house, going and knocking on the door at Himawari. He's like, wait a minute. Person says, hold on a minute. They left Himawari at home. Uh-oh. He says, Naruto, you idiot! If you didn't come to fight, Himawari wouldn't be left home alone. He goes, Christian says, duh, my nephew, duh, and rushes over and kicks down the door. Says, Himawari, are you alright? He says, I'm fine. He says, well, you want to go on a journey with me, Boruto, and Sarda? He says, sure. He says, alright. That's good. He says, Christian says, well, I'm gonna need something to do sooner or later. Christian says, I'm gonna stop getting these guys getting punched in the face by their own wives. I'm gonna need to find someone else to do this with. Christian heads to the hidden sand village to see how Gaara is doing, and he says, oh, hey, Gaara, and he says, oh, and he sees a little boy trying to attack him with black sand. He says, blocking the sand immediately. He says, Shinki, no, don't do that. Bad. Shinki, don't do that. He says, I'm sorry. He goes, oh, and who is this little feller? He says, this is my son. Shinki says, is he your son or is he adopted? He says, adopted son. He says, damn, Gaara, you're smart. I kind of wish I did that. You know, I think I might do that when I get back to Leaf Village. Because I need something else to do in my life, because I am bored. So Christian would head back to Leaf Village and say, I'd like to come to the orphanage. So he heads to the orphanage to go find a child to adopt. He looks through all of them to find the perfect child who is innocent and nice and does nothing wrong. He decides to get two. He wants a nice one and a mean one. He says, they say, why do you want a mean one? He says, because I want to teach it the right way and rebuild Indra and Asuda. I want these three to be the peacemakers when I want one of them to be my successors. He says, so he finds one of them. He finds two of them. He says, oh, cool. So, I guess you... So, when he does, he adopts a 9-year-old who is the same age as Boruto and Sarda, named Koji. He says, this is Koji. He says, cool. He says, I think I'm gonna name you. You could stay as Koji, actually. And how about him? He takes another one who's about 4 years old. He's about actually no, he's the same age as Himawari. He's about 6 years old. He says, alright, I'll take you, and you, the nice one. He says, I'll name you Kazumi. He says, cool. I'll name it. So, Christian would say, alright, you three are coming with me. He takes them with him, saying, this is too much fun. He enjoys himself way too much, saying, so, what do you guys want to do? They remember, they say, are you gonna hurt us? The younger one says, are you gonna hurt us? He said, no, why would I do that? I am the Sage of Six Paths. I am here to make truth. He says, the nice one says, the Sage of Six Paths has adopted me? Awesome! He says, well, you're enthusiastic. He says, sorry, was that bad? He says, no, that's good. That's what I want. Enthusiasm and niceness. He said, the other one says, whatever. I don't care about kindness. I never had that as a kid. And he says, not now, Koji. I will treat you better than whoever ever treated you. You two will be the best, and I will train you with all my heart. I'll make you guys fully fledged shinobi that are nice and can bring peace like Indra and like Ashura did one day. And I will teach. So after a while, so he trains them for so many years. He doesn't tell any of his friends about it yet, because he wants it to be a surprise. He says, okay, and he teaches them all about ninjutsu, a couple of jutsu. He teaches them just a couple of jutsu, saying, well, whatever. If you guys saw that Shinobi Striker thing, I legit killed the guy with the, thing. So, back to the what if. 5 years later. Boruto is, well actually no, 2 years later. Thing is now 9, Kazumi is 9. Koji, who's gotten a little nicer, is 11. He says, Kazumi, Koji, will you be enrolling into the academy? He says, yes, I will, father. He says, you can call me father. He says, oh my god. He says, sorry, was I not meant to call you father? He says, no, I'm so proud of you. He says, huh? He says, good. He says, you've actually never called me that before. He says, so good job. So, after training, he says, you both are trained up, show me your best jutsus. And also he says, wait, I got one more gift. And taps them both on the head, giving them Otsutsuki clothes, saying, you are now wearing the perfect drip. I drop my control. When he comes, he says, Kazumi, he says, Koji Uchiha. He says, what? Sarada says, Uchiha? He says, Uchiha? He says, here. He says, you're Kazumi? Oh yeah, and I forgot to say something. Christian decided to be a super duper nice guy and give Koji the Sharingan, and planted Sharingan into him, and gave his other sibling the Byakugan. He gave him the Byakugan, and the other one, he says, cool, you're an Uchiha? He says, let's see your Sharingan. He says, going into his one Tomoe Sharingan, she's like, awesome, he can use the Sharingan? He says, yeah. He said, but then when Boruto was about to ram into Naruto's statue, Christian would appear and say, wind barrier! Cutting through, about to, and Naruto's like, no, it's gonna explode! Christian would jump in and yeet Boruto and Denki out. And say, Susanoo! With his Susanoo arm, crushes the bus, saying, you guys okay? He lands on top, and every single kid in the academy says, so cool! He lands and says, and Boruto backflips off of him and says, Boruto, Uzumaki is here, he says. Christian says, well, you've been egoistic. He says, haha, and he goes, yeah, you're just like your dad. Egoistic as ever. He says, is it bad? He says, no, it's not. It's just you're very egoistic. He says, what does that mean? No one taught you anything, did they? He says, nope. He says, he just, after explaining what egoistic, he says, I don't want to be egoistic. He says, thank you. Good job, good job, good job. He says, high five. You both get lollipops. Now see you later. And disappears. And he says, oh, Kazumi. And he says, oh, Koji. Here you go. And gives him a lollipop too. He says, oh, I'm a nice guy. Lollipops for everyone. He says, this guy is way too enthusiastic. He says, brother, he says, what did you just say? He says, nothing. He says, that's what I thought. And just dips. He goes, da 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 da. He says, then he just teleports out and he says, Kazumi, make sure you behave, or there will be consequences. Naruto says, does he ever hit you? He says, no, he just scares me sometimes for fun, whenever I'm mean. He says, Naruto, I heard that. And also, I am not mean to my son, to my child. I only get mad at him when he bullies his little brother sometimes. But he stopped that a year ago. Once they finally got along. He says, oh, so Christian would say, well, I'm going, everyone. So, after a while of being in the academy, Kazumi is the strongest in the academy. One day, they'd be doing a summoning of Konohamaru, showing the class summoning jutsu. They all go, so cool, and he says, really, Konohamaru? Flexing? And he also says, wait, isn't that also being a predator? When he starts to blush when all the academy girls go, ooh, he says, hey, isn't that also kind of predatoring? He says, why do you have to be so realistic? He says, if you guys want to see something cool, then watch this. I'll show you two good things. Wind barrier. Creating a wind vortex around him, saying, they go, whoa. And then he says, then he bites his finger and says, and says, ha, not. And heals his finger instantly, he says, and snaps his fingers, going. All kinds of crows start going after Konohamaru, start poking him, and he says, ah, and they all start to laugh, saying, ha ha ha. And he says, okay, I'll actually show you guys a summoning jutsu. Summoning jutsu. Ga, and summons Gamakichi. And he says, this is Gamakichi. He says, they all say, nice to meet you, Gamakichi. And he says, who are these kids? And he says, these are the academy students. As you can see by one of them, he looks like a Naruto look-alike. He says, yeah, he does. He says, and Boruto yells, I do not. He says, you do. Why do you not want to accept it? He says, you look like Naruto. He says, and he goes, he says, and he says, I'll show you guys one last thing. Susanoo! Doing this. Going into Susanoo, they're all like, oh! He says, they're like, that's almost bigger than the village. He says, well, he says, hey, Konohamaru, when's the next field trip? He says, the next field trip is in about 10 days. He said, Christian says, hey, can we change that field trip up? He says, what? Why? He says, I want to take the students on a journey around the world, except it won't be too much of a thing for Sarada and Boruto, since they've already seen around the world. He says, and it will cost no money, because I'll do that for free, because I think it's just fun for children to learn about that stuff. He says, okay, sure, I'll ask Iruka. So he asks Iruka, so after asking Iruka, he says, that's a perfect idea. It's a good history lesson. He's sure. Christian, so they'd say, class, we have a surprise visitor. 10 days later, actually. Christian walks in the room and says, hey. They all say, it's the Sage of Six Paths. He says, well, we have a good field trip for you guys. They say, what's the field trip? So, he says, the field trip is going on an around-the-world trip of my Susanoo. He says, what? Your Susanoo? He says, that's right, guys. Susanoo. So everyone, after walking outside, Naruto says, I don't know if this is a good field trip idea. He says, come on, Naruto, yes it is. He goes, Susanoo. They all climb it. He creates about 30 shadow clones to pick everyone up into the Susanoo. Then the shadow clones poof. He says, alright, good. So, we're all good. Going at full speed. Trying to show that he is the top. And going fullest of the fullest. Basically just reclaiming everything. Basically saying, well, this is fun, isn't it, everyone? They all say, yeah. He says, wow, Naruto says, wow, he's doing a lot for this village. Shouldn't he be scaling the other villages too? He says, yeah, but it's his home village, so of course he's going to protect it. Christian says, He says, well, I guess I could do this, though. How about I do this? He says, he sends a relayed message to Naruto. He says, What? So he sends a relayed message to Naruto saying, "Hey Naruto, can you let Kazumi come to the Hokage house? He'll help you with your work if anything." Naruto instantly agrees in his head saying, "Yes, I need help, please." He says, "But what is he gonna do?" He says, "I taught him almost everything about the shinobi world and how things will work. I taught him all that. So I'm pretty sure he'll be a good help. And tell him he might get a prize. Just don't give him a prize. I want to give him a prize. You see, I haven't," and he says, see, "I haven't taken him on the world trip yet. I haven't taken him on an around the world trip like I have with Boruto and Sarada." He says, "I haven't taken them on an around the world trip. So, that's gonna be their gift." He says that's gonna be his gift. Not Kazumi's gift, because Kazumi didn't really do anything. And also because Kazumi had his gift. He says, "Isn't that kind of like favoriting child?" He says, "No, Kazumi gets to go then. Koji gets to go now. Kazumi gets to go then." "Ah, dang it!" He says, "Just please do it. Do it for me, Naruto, please. I need this. I can't take care of him." And he says, "Wait, can't Kazumi just take care of himself? He's an insanely strong shinobi." He says, "No, he's like Ashura. He's not that strong, even though I have taught him one jutsu. I've taught him a couple of jutsus that he struggled to learn, but he still learned them. He's still good." So after a while, after about 5 hours, they return home. Back to the leaf, and he says, "Haha, so guys, how's that?" And they all say, "That was awesome!" Boruto started to say, "Meh, we've seen that before." And they say, "What?" He says, "Yeah, he's our uncle. We've met him. We've done this before." He says, "Lucky." He says, "Yeah, you're you know the Sage of the Six Paths?" Sarada says, "I'm related to him." He says, "What?" He says, "You're a part of the Otsutsuki clan?" He says, "No, he's an Uchiha." He says, "What? He's an Uchiha?" He says, "I don't think he's used much of his abilities. None of us in the class have seen him fight. If we do, then," he said, Hirsch would say, "Well, this is good." So when they return back, he'd say, "Looks like I'm good for doing this." So the next day, Christian would be like, "Oh, I am very bored." He says, "Kazumi, Koji, want a new jutsu?" He says, "Sure." He says, "Amethyst Orb!" And yeets it into a rock, exploding that rock with a crater under it. He says, "Oh, so I see you like it." He says, "Good. Because this won't be the jutsu you're learning." They're like, "Why?" He says, "This jutsu is way too dangerous. And I don't trust you two with this jutsu. You both are mischievous little creatures." He says, "Creatures? I'm kidding. You guys are mischievous children. You guys will do anything for entertainment." He says, "Yeah, you're right." He says, "Quiet, Kazumi. We don't want him to know that." He says, Christian would say, "Koji, don't talk like that to Kazumi. Say it. Say sorry." He says, "Sorry, Kazumi." He says, "It's okay, Koji." He says, "Ugh." And he goes, "We still gotta work on your kindness." He says, "Whatever." He says, "Aren't you happy that you got into a family?" He says, "Yes. So be nice to your little brother. He's a nice kid. He hasn't done anything wrong to you. If anything, he likes you the best. He would probably sacrifice himself for you. Isn't that right, Koji? Isn't that right, Kazumi?" He says, "Yes, of course I would. Anything for you, bro." He says, Koji starts to tear up and says, "Really?" "Well, I don't care." He said, "Thanks." They'd finally make up and be best friends. He'd say, "Good job, you two. Looks like I've taught you well." He says, "Sure." He says, "Whatever. You two get some sleep. I have to go do my work now." He says, "Why do you do work at night?" He says, "Because we've got a problem in the shinobi world. The shinobi world will never be pure. it will never, ever be pure. We still need to find a way for peace in the shinobi world. Even if the 5 great nations are pure together, that doesn't mean the world is at peace. I have to go around, so I'll be back. And runs out the leaf village to stop all problems. Person would say, this is a great day to be alive. He says, let's get down to business. He doesn't even have to do anything. So when he goes out in the night, he says, whew. He says, hey Naruto, how's that free ramen pass going for ya? He says, pretty good. He says, so, where are Kazumi and Koji? He says, sleeping. He says, wait, how do you know about them? He says, Boruto told me about Koji, and he told me that Kazumi also said that he had a little brother. He says, oh. He says, cool. So, after that, they start to eat. These two being friends. He says, when can we actually have a real fight? He says, I don't know. My work is busy. He says, Christian says, your work is busy. Your work is busy. Your work is busy. That is, I wish I could do your job. He says, what? He says, I wish I could do your job. Your job seems insanely fun. You don't have to go around the world, waste most of your chakra on going around the world looking to stop problems. What do? You sit in an office all day. I would love that. I've got millions of mosquito bites, and I don't even think I still think I have triple E. He says, what's triple E? He says, it's a disease when the wrong mosquito bites you, but I've had to heal it so many times that I'm pretty sure I'm immune to it. He says, your job is way less harder than mine. He says, oh really? He says, yeah. He says, and he says, well, we're settling this outside. Get out here. We're settling this outside. So they go and they say, he say, and that guy's it for this part of What If I Was a Naruto Remastered. Goodbye.